Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and during our half-hour programs, as you certainly know by now, in our 16th year, I talk to artists, usually writers, but sometimes other forms of artists. We've had on musicians, we've had on actors, we've had on painters, of course. So we cast a pretty wide net. If you've got an idea for someone on the show, or if you'd like to be on the show yourself, please watch for our address at the end of the program. I also want to remind you that past episodes are available at Sawyer Free Library here in Gloucester. You can go in and take out a tape, or in some cases a CD, and bring it home, watch it, bring it back as you would a book. So keep that in mind. I want to say tonight that we do have a writer and historian and librarian. His name is Roger Brisson, and he started as the new director of the Gloucester Lyceum and Sawyer Free Library in January. Roger was born in Canada, but has been here many years, and for a couple of years been in Rockport. He has as a hobby, very time-consuming hobby at times, I suspect, house restoration, but he is primarily a librarian and a historian and very involved in technical IT aspects of the development of library science. He has written and talked and thought a great deal about a general subject that I want to use as our springboard this evening, and that is the use of computers and computer-related technology in the humanities, a concept that some still see as a little bit of a clash, although that's not true, and we're going to convince you of that tonight. Roger Brisson, very glad to have you on the show. Thanks for coming down.
Yes.
And congratulations, first of all, on your directorship at the Gloucester Lyceum and Sawyer Free Library.
Thank you very much. Yes, very happy to be here.
Now, have you run across people that think that computers and humanities still are a little bit at odds? And if so, I'll bet you have. If so, how do you convince them otherwise?
Well, the humanities have always needed a means of being able to do research. And in point of fact, it was really the humanities that really began with using computers very early in the 1970s for the analysis of texts. And it even gets more an anomaly because we have the scholars of ancient history who begin using computers in the late 70s to bring together all of these fragments of texts from ancient Greek and Roman history to be able to analyze them. And so it's really, at that time, and it was really the seed money from someone from the computer industry, the Hewlett-Packard dynasty, and it was actually the Packard family, who gave literally millions of dollars to build what became the largest database of all the textual material of ancient Greece and Rome, so that scholars could use this database to study and analyze ancient texts. By the mid-'80s, this database was largely completed. So at a very early stage in the development of personal computers and the internet, we have scholars in the humanities heavily using computers in their research.
So it's not in any sense pushing humanities out because it's cold and electronic, but it's helping the research and the background and the digging that humanities have always depended on.
That's right. So humanities scholars have become comfortable with the use of computers way back. Today their use of computers is for them standard. It's critical.
When did you start using a computer?
Actually, I can say that my entire adult career has followed this progress because my own undergraduate study was in ancient history as well. And as a research assistant for my undergraduate advisor, and this is the late 70s, I was already putting together records, electronic records of justices of the peace from the 15th century for a book that my undergraduate advisor was working on, analyzing what the professions, the backgrounds, the biographies of justices of the peace of 15th century England. And so, of course, he had to bring together hundreds of them, and so I went about looking for these biographies and putting this together and preparing it for computer input. Well, at that time, computer input was not just simply keying it in, of course, we were using the cards.
I was going to ask, did you miss the cards?
No, I did catch the cards just at the tail end of it. And of course, it was right at that time that I saw my first personal computers, and that was the Apple IIs that, of course, came on the market at the end of the 70s. And I still remember clearly in the Rare Book Library that I worked as by that time, a beginning graduate student. We spent over $10,000 for these two Apple II computers.
Whoa.
And we had a special room for these computers, and this was huge. It was a very big thing for the library when our first two computers were brought into the library, and only specially trained librarians could use them, of course, and they had to go to workshops and classes.
$10,000.
Yeah, for two little personal computers.
And now with $10,000, you could buy 50, and each with about 5,000 times the capacity of those original Apple IIs.
Yeah, when you think about this here, the computer I have with me, there's no comparison. So I actually paralleled that development, and it continued as sort of a profile. It wasn't really that I was looking to work in computers, and at that time they just simply were there, and I was busy doing research in ancient history and early modern European history. And it really wasn't until I began teaching when I lived in Germany in the mid-'80s that it clicked for me that a Macintosh computer could be very useful for a teacher. And so back, it was 1985, I bought a Macintosh computer for my teaching, to create the syllabi for the classes, for managing the homework, for doing grades. And so by the time I was in a routine as a young teacher, I had already fully integrated the use of a computer in my work, and of course it saved me a lot of time.
You were considerably ahead of the curve of most people in the country.
Yeah.
Were you ahead of the curve in relation to your friends and colleagues?
Absolutely. I was completely exotic. I don't know why that was. It was just simply, it made sense to me to use this tool, this machine, that would make my work easier. And I guess if there's some sort of leitmotif to my career, it's always been thinking, gosh, if I could use this computer to do this work, it would save me a lot of time and effort. And that continued. So when I entered libraries in the 90s, it was the same thing. It was using computers to make the work of librarians easier.
You had one master's degree in art history, is that correct?
In European history.
In European history.
Yes.
And then you went to library school to get an MLS.
Well, they were together. That was a program at UCLA that allowed me to get the two degrees at the same time. It was a 3-year program. And then I went right on to work on my doctorate, my PhD.
So you took both of those degrees at the same time.
Together.
I got that confused from your
right.
your resume.
Yeah.
When was that, and why did you decide that you wanted to move towards library science?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. That was in the early 80s when I went to library school and worked on my master's in history. And the reason is very simple. I was doing research, archaeological research in Greece, and I still remember sitting and talking with my advisor in ancient history. And we were chatting, and he asked me what I wanted to do with my degree in ancient history. And I said, Professor Carroll, what else do you do with a degree in ancient history except teach? And so I was planning on going on, and getting my PhD and becoming a professor. But he said, this is the late 70s. Roger, have you thought about academic librarianship? That there's a lot going on in librarianship. This is when the first Apple computers were coming on the market, so he had a real eye for this. And of course, he was using these databases. And so he said, Roger, think about academic librarianship. That could be a very, very interesting career. The outlook for teaching at the university level was already the signs were that there was going to be an
Dismal,
overabundance,
dismal, yeah.
very dismal. So that was probably the best advice I'd ever gotten. I think it was really prophetic, and I went on and I was able to do this dual degree because I still wasn't sure about this. You know, I was still very interested in history and in scholarship. But he was absolutely right. Librarianship was so interesting.
And you had already seen from your own experience how valuable it could be as an informational resource, a data resource.
Absolutely. And what's really become interesting, and it's only increased, and we're living in the middle of this right now, is that my generation and young people today going into librarianship, we're defining what libraries are in the 21st century.
And there are no real guidelines.
There's no real, well, what we're trying to do is pull the best from history, as we've always done when we redefine ourselves. So we're looking at the things the principles and the essential concepts of libraries, behind libraries, what inform libraries, and we want to apply them in this whole new realm of activity. So if we look at things like reading, for example, I mean, it really gets to that level where we really understand now in a way that we didn't understand 20 years ago. There is a huge spectrum of types or kinds of reading. We don't just read. We read in a lot of different ways. And so in our analyzing that and looking at how people read and read different kinds of things helps us to think about, well, how should we be structuring this for this library of the future? And it's been very exciting.
What do you say to people, and I've heard them say this often, the internet should be kept out of libraries or limited to a dark corner because I want the old fabric, the old rag fabric of the book in my hand, and I can't read a screen, nor can I envision sheeted displays that I might fold up in my pocket.
Well, I'll continue with that. You know, and it continues even today. People will say, they'll see a computer or something like these little pocket PCs, and this pocket PC here has 300-400 books in it, including audio books and books from the whole range of literature and history and
more memory than those original apples you bought for
slightly.
$5,000 each.
Yeah, slightly. And people will say the same thing to me. How can you read on something like this? Well, I read with this. I've had a pocket PC like this for over 10 years now. And I read whole books on this without any problem. I read whole books on laptop computers without any problem. I wouldn't read a book on a desktop computer. The question is ergonomics. How comfortable is it to read with these devices? So when someone comes to me and says, you really can't read with this kind of thing, what we really are looking at is, of course, every person has a particular kind of perception of what they imagine reading on a computer is. And most people do have a perception of reading with a desktop.
Sit rigidly in front of the desktop.
And that's no fun. I would never do that myself. I relax, and this is why they call it a laptop. I relax with my laptop, and I open it, and this is a very comfortable way for me to read. And the text is much sharper than a book.
The screens have gotten much, much better in the last few years.
Incomparably better, yeah, now. And what I can do about books today online is that I can adjust the font. I can make the text bigger or smaller at will.
Good for older eyes sometimes. Not speaking of you, speaking of myself.
That's right. Well, I've wondered myself as time has gone on. But there's so many advantages for me personally to have a book, and I'm talking about a contemporary novel, anything, on the screen here for comfortable reading. So with the question of the library, and these things should not be in the library, well, to that I would say it really depends on the person, and it depends on the kind of material that we're looking at and reading. And here we've come to distinguish between, there's varieties within each category, but I could say that we're really talking now about two particular types of reading. And one is the type of reading that I would call narrative reading, or maybe reading as an aesthetic experience. It's much like when we appreciate an artwork, or when we have any sort of aesthetic experience. That's, I think, the kind of reading people have in mind when they criticize the computers in the library and say, I want to get comfortable in the library, and I want to have a novel, say something like a contemporary novel, and I want to have this experience of reading comfortably this novel narratively, and that's fine. This is a perfectly legitimate use of applying books, using books, and reading, and there's a place for that in the library. But there's other types of books that I would contend that, and there's a whole series, what we would call utilitarian books or functional books, how to build a website, how to, maybe informational books about current topics. Things like this.
Would you hold that up again, or for a bit longer? Our director, Bob McClinchy, will catch that. Evolution versus creationism, a very hot topic.
Very hot, yes.
Not perhaps so much in Massachusetts. Thank God.
But I think we still have an interest in the topic to know what's going on elsewhere, maybe.
I think there's another problem with books. That sometimes when I have one of Simon Schama's histories in hardbound or something, it just weighs so much.
It's big.
You want. I don't have a handheld PC, but you want something more comfortable because it'll cut off the circulation in your legs eventually if you rest it there, and it's too heavy on your stomach in bed. So some books can be physically too big.
Yeah.
Well, or old encyclopedia. Volumes are an example of that.
Perfect example. And that really is this other type of reading that I wanted to highlight. And that's, with the building the website and these other utilitarian books that we have here. That's informational reading. People are looking for something in particular. They're looking for something specifically when they do this kind of reading. That's very different reading than the narrative reading that is the aesthetic experience. That I really want to, when I pick up Anita Diamant, I want to experience her as an author. And so reading her as she wants to be read, as a narrative, is key to the experience. I'm not reading this novel for information.
So you make that choice to read hard copy, and you make the distinction between narrative as hard copy as narrative rather than screen as narrative.
That's right.
Why is there not narrative on the screen?
There can be, and I do. As I said, with the Pocket PC, I have a lot of novels with this, so I'm comfortable with that.
But you do choose...
I choose this as well.
Yes.
I have to say, I looked for this online to get to be able to buy it and purchase it as a download.
So this is a default.
It's sort of, I guess, increasingly maybe I would have
default decision.
Yeah, so I guess at this point in my own behavior in my life, and in terms of the ergonomics, how comfortable computers have gotten, it's probably a 50-50. Sometimes I'll buy the book. But if I have a choice and the electronic version is there too, a lot of times I'll buy the electronic version as well.
I think you're quite right. When most people that I've talked to think of reading a book on a screen, they say, well, I've got to go to the den, I've got to sit in my rigid chair, I've got to look at the only PC in the house and read it on a screen that is catching reflective light from the kitchen, and it's just not comfortable.
Absolutely.
And that's simply not necessary any longer.
Yeah, and that's been a big part of what I've done in my career, is to focus on the ergonomics. When we, at Harvard, where I was working just the past month, in the department I worked in, we would process 30,000 books a month would come through our department, that we would be receiving, new books coming in, that we would be paying for, that would be processing, cataloging, preparing for the shelves. That's a lot of books. And so larger libraries and even smaller ones, we're dealing with quantities where we have to be thinking in terms of ergonomics. And so the reading experience is just all part of this. And for the informational side, this sort of reading for information, the ergonomics is a huge part of it. And so what we as librarians have been doing for the past at least decade now is try to find ways of optimizing the computer environment to allow us to make use of that informational realm of looking for information. And when we think about reading for information, virtually always we're satisfying an information need. We're looking for something in particular. What was that? Who was that author? Or what's that recipe? You know, specific things. And it might be a how-to kind of thing. It might be something like, you know, how do I build a website? You know, or how do I fix my car? So it's a specific need we have. And if I had to look for that narratively, as we've done for centuries with books, well, we know what that's like. You could spend, it's the needle in the haystack syndrome. Unless you have a real good sense for how to find things, you would probably, if you were lucky, you'd go to a librarian and ask how to find that information.
I can remember a pre-computer sitting in grad school in a little carrel with books piled up here and books piled up, so you couldn't see out of your carrel, looking for about 4 or 5 paragraphs.
Pieces of information, yep.
More than time-consuming, aggravating, annoying, and headache-inducing.
Yeah.
I want to ask you if you can take the idea of informational reading and data databases which contain vast stores of that, and literary reading, and how they fuse into what might be a future library. What are libraries going to be like? I mentioned before, I was going to ask you what a library might be like in 30 years.
Yeah.
You make it 10 or 20 or 30, but when many of the decisions posed to library directors now have been made, and libraries have a new path staked out for them, what will they be doing? What will they be like?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would personally, being very frank, I think that this melding, that sort of idea that you bring up of these massive databases with books, as narratives, I'm not prepared to say whether that's going to happen. Right now, my sense is go ahead.
But I didn't mean that they would be fused, but you've got to serve different different clients. So
Yes.
some people are going to come in wanting the data. Some people are going to come in wanting to read Huckleberry Finn.
Okay.
How does the library
Very good. Yeah,
function with those multiple clients?
I'm much more comfortable with looking at that, and how I see this unfolding now is we're going to be building our libraries to satisfy both types of needs. So I'm playing the role that I can to position libraries. We know that Google alone doesn't do it. And that's why, a lot of people have said, well, we've got Google, why do we need libraries anymore? Information is just too complex. And so I'm doing what I can to position libraries that we still play that central role of helping the community, helping users, helping patrons to find information they're looking for. So that's going to be virtually all electronic. I don't see much of that type of information or satisfying that need existing in print in 20 years. So we're going to be very comfortable with that. And we see this behavior with young people today. Each new generation is more and more comfortable with just going to the computer to find information they need.
So the library might not subscribe to 30 journals.
That's
it
right.
will not buy traditional encyclopedia. We think of Collier's or Britannica.
Yeah.
Those will no longer be hard copy residents of the library.
That's happening more quickly than 20 years. In at least the larger academic libraries, a very significant percentage of our collections budgets are now being used for just electronic journals and just electronic encyclopedias, and they're not existing in print anymore already. We're already there. That's happening.
And the space saved by throwing out all the Britannicas, is that new space going to be occupied by more terminals, or is it going to be occupied by paper books?
What we're seeing in the library is both. We're seeing certainly there are the banks of terminals where patrons can sit and work with the computers and do things, and that is happening. But what we're also seeing in libraries, in the newest libraries, is a lot more space where people can comfortably sit, where they have nice armchairs, where there's nice tables, task lighting, no longer the fluorescent lighting.
And coffee.
And coffee, yes, absolutely. The cafes I find essential. One of my favorite things is with a friend to go to a library, and a really a good library with good collections, and go through and spend about 20 minutes looking for the books we want at that moment, and meet together at the cafe, in the library, with a pile of books, and talk about our books. That's my favorite evening. I can't think
There's
of a
some
better
wonderful
thing to
new
do.
libraries with beautiful shops in them. Libraries can generate a little money, and you can have some coffee. The Saratoga Springs Library I happened to be in recently is a beautiful example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a library's definition is going to be changing because the needs of the population are going to be changing.
That's
Now,
right.
Well, one aspect of that seems to me, I've got to hurry because Bob McGlinchey just gave me a 5-minute signal. That was a minute ago. Many people will have computers at home. Most people do now.
Mm-hmm.
How do you draw them out?
There's going to be a lot of questions. As I said, the universe of information online is very complex. So we hope that the community will come to learn that the library is going to be a really good place to get started, to ask questions, and that might be online as well. They might send us an email, the 24/7 reference service, but it could be a phone call. It could be coming into the library.
Not the University of Chicago, but the Chicago Public, among others, has that service. I've used it.
We want it here, 24/7.
I just got the 3-minute signal. I've got one quick follow-up question before we have to begin to close off. I didn't get to half the questions I wanted to ask, but you are the director of the library here in Gloucester. Will the Gloucester Lyceum and Sawyer Free Library be a leader in that kind of evolution?
I would like it to be. I would like it to be. I'm certainly I have the background and experience. I've been on that bleeding edge of this development in my career, we're serving the needs of the community. So of course we're anticipating. So it really depends on the community whether we become that model for other Massachusetts libraries or even nationally.
Well, that's good. That's exciting.
Yeah.
And often people don't think of libraries as exciting places, but I've always found them so. And more and more people, because of your stewardship over here, I'm sure will.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
I have to thank you, Roger, for being on the show. We have run out of time already. Roger Brisson, the new director of the library here in Gloucester. And I want to thank you in Cablecast land as well for being with us on the Writer's Block. If you've gotten a little bit excited about libraries and the future of libraries and the new roles they're going to play, especially the new role the Gloucester Library is going to play here in the city, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.